Thank you very much indeed, Chairman, and I do welcome you all on this Ash Wednesday, as some of you will be thinking what to give up and the others won't be giving up or anything. But it is lovely to see you all here, particularly the students, but everyone is very welcome. My first address to this institute was in 1969. It was one of the first addresses I gave, and my record shows I've done around about 7,500 outside my lectures since then in 42 countries, so I hope that's global enough. And I did ask the students what global meant, and the answers varied, but I just didn't think it was graphic enough. Whatever you do, make it graphic, all right? Which is why I'm not using overhead slides tonight. Best definition came to me on my computer of the tragic story of an English princess who died in a French tunnel with a Belgian driver in a German car, pursued by Italian paparazzi, sent to a French hospital, attended by an American doctor, and all of that came on my Korean computer with the Vietnamese co-processor sent from Japan and picked up in the wharf by Indonesian workers and sent to my IT department, where the Vietnamese IT people gave it to the Chinese, who gave it to me. That is globalization. We have, it's always been interesting times, to accept the Chinese proverb, and if the economy is ever boring, it's because boring people are talking about it. There's just so much, and to do anything, justice to anything, I have to be very, very selective, and I thought the most efficient way to do this was to reduce some of the main facts to a piece of paper which is before you. So this is a working session, so if you'd be good enough to take it up, I want to run through just a few of them, and you can take it home and reflect on them, because this isn't the death of President Kennedy, but you'll be able to locate where you were at some of these. Let's go back nearly 20 years to the middle of 1997, and developing in Malaysia and Singapore and Korea the Asian financial crisis, and there were doom and gloom forecasts that this was the end of the world, and it seemed to pass and people have largely forgotten about it. We move on. We had a period, and this is something to reflect on, between the middle 1990s, about that time, and 2001, where the growth in the American economy, as measured by real, that means take the price bit out of it, gross domestic product, was a fairly unspectacular 1.5% on the average, and yet that didn't faze the stock market, because the Dow Jones index, which contains how many stocks? 30 only, and emerged from 1896, moved from about 6,500 points, this doesn't mean anything, but you just look at it comparatively, to 11,000. So what were they thinking of when the economy was growing so slowly? And then from 2001, the 9/11 period, where the index plunged, the American economy grew on the average of about 3 years until the global financial crisis started. You can date it somewhere around 2007 or 8, and yet equity market prices did not regain. So what is the connection between the growth in the economy and business profits and the share values that reflect the ownership of the companies? It's not simple, is it? And economics is all about relationships. I'm an expert in relationship because I only ever had one girlfriend, been my wife for 44 years, 3 weeks, 2 days, and almost 23 hours. And so that relationship has given me enough time, because I didn't have any complicated love life to interfere with real things, to study other relationships. So we look at the relationship between events like shock disasters and legislative changes and so on, and bringing in such radically efficient things like National Company Security Exchange, and bringing in Lysart former employees to run them, without mentioning Henry in particular. And shock events like tsunamis, shock events like changes of government, and new tax systems like the goods and services tax. So we look at the relationship between these generators of change, and we anticipate budgets, elections, and so on to do things. That's what economics is about, and we use various tools like econometrics to try and measure the responses. So the broad history of what's happened, we were talking about American subprime crisis, which is basically undocumented loans, or loans to particularly the Northeast American housing sector, to people with dubious financial credentials. And the competition, which can become excessive, led to the wrong sort of results. And this was just a disaster waiting to happen, but it took a while to happen. And then slowly the disasters unfolded, and this happened during 2007 and 2008. But this did not stop the Reserve Bank of Australia, formerly known as the Reserve Bank of Australia, from raising interest rates 3 more times when it was evident to the proverbial drover's dog that the global financial crisis was with it. Now just a little pen picture on that. Facts, you can draw your own analysis. The bank then said, uh-oh, we got it wrong. So there's a thing called the cash rate, which no one pays, but everyone pays attention to it, which is what happens if any of the main banks run out of money on a short-term basis. They borrow from the central bank that prints the money, so they've got plenty of it. And this is the rate they charge, because they make sure they don't do that. But it is the rate that is the pivot from which most rates follow, but not rigidly, because the banks like playing games and treasurers like attacking banks, and so we have a game which is smothering up the reality of this. So this Reserve Bank cash rate, presently 3.000%, and in the view of almost every economist, likely to be lower than that by the end of the year. And I'm one of 2 economists in the Age Fairfax surveys who think it'll be higher than that at the end of the year. So got some controversy to deal with just to whet your appetite. And the bank then said, well, we got that wrong, so let's go down. 6 trips down, bang, 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 until they found 3%, which we are now. And then suddenly the global financial crisis didn't hit Australia, because you must have followed the rhetoric. Australia avoided the global financial crisis. We never had no recession. So it must be right, isn't it? Even the bank woke up to this and said, oh, okay, so 7 steps upwards. Get it back to where it was. Not quite, but almost. But then didn't look so good. So I said, oh, okay, so 6 steps backwards. Down we go again. How destabilising is this? Now, a year ago, I made a public statement on the Financial Review and in media, challenging the bank that it had a lot of research and reports, but it had never evaluated its own forecasts. Well, I'm wrong, they've now done it. And the bank has found 2 things. Number 1, they're very good at forecasting inflation. Well, it's like forecasting that I'm not going to give birth in the next 6 months. And I'm confident that that's the case. But it's only a forecast, you know, might be wrong. Arnold Schwarzenegger. And the second thing they found is that they're not very good at forecasting real activity, which means the growth in the sort of volume side of the economy. It's hard, that one, isn't it? About the volume side of the economy, because 80% now of the economy doesn't have any volume. Like my services. What's the volume here? I mean, it's not just our physical existence, but virtuals and services, hair cutting, everything. That's what dominates the modern economy. So the volume side we keep talking about, we need to think about it. So let's reflect on that, because the response of the central bank to their interpretation about where the economy is going has been, in my opinion, very destabilising. In my opinion, it would have been better to lock the rates up 4.5%. Hardly any economist agrees with me, because they're indoctrinated with monetarism that exaggerates the significance of interest rates and presumes you can forecast where you're going. And yet the leading monetarist of them all, Milton Friedmaniac, said this is not the case. Forecasting is extremely difficult. You shouldn't try it. I don't agree with him, you shouldn't try it, but there it is. So we went through this very destabilising course. I mean, we had a change of government at the end of 2007, remember Kevin 07. And the expectation, I don't like expectations, not one of them anyway, not just one expectation, was here's a new government, been out of office for a long time. Hardly anyone, including the Prime Minister, had been in a ministerial position before. So they grinned, they're going to get it wrong. Well, they whipped in the stimulus packages. And I don't think people realise what a challenge this was, because the dominating advisors are indoctrinated with a very classical view of the world, and these are people who are speechwriters with economics degrees and so on. And they're brought up that stimulus packages are bad stuff. They're going to crowd out the private sector, and they make the deficits bigger, and the working rule is you mustn't have deficits. And if you've got deficits, you must get them out as quickly as possible. And that means that you don't want stimulus packages. Well, name a country in 2007 or 8 or 9, anywhere in the world, who did not have stimulus packages. Who had the biggest ones? The Chinese. They're always quick in responding to this. Chinese wanted about 10.5% of GDP. Australia was second or third, depending on the numbers, if you put the two packages together in December 07 and April 2008. But they moved pretty quickly. Now, the common answer given by the conventional economists is that Australia avoided the global financial crisis because it had China and mining. That's part of it, can't deny it. But the stimulus packages also worked very, very quickly. And if anything, they're probably on too long. If anything, there it is. But people said to me, how could you possibly support that? It's going to go to the do-nothings who just gamble and drink it and smoke it. I don't care. They spend it. Maybe I do care. But I don't care as an economist. I might care as a person or a parent. So it sort of worked. So here's this government that was just come in, expected to blow things, did a very, very good thing. And any objective account of the first 6 to 12 months of the Rudd government has to have them looking rather good. And then they went bonkers. I do not understand what happened. I do have friends in Canberra that tell me things behind the scenes about why they had to wallpaper certain people of high offices' walls, or why people couldn't work with senior members of the Rudd government, and the turnover was enormous, and the tantrums and so on. I don't know why this happened. They were sitting pretty. I just don't understand it. And then the Prime Minister lost office. Not because he was voted out by the electors. His own party said, we've had enough of you. The events in the middle of 2010. And when we look back over 2010, we were content that we'd largely survived the global financial crisis. I don't buy that entirely. Talk to the tourism people in Queensland. Talk to some of the young people who were jobs as lawyers and accountants. If they had one, turning up 5 days a week and paid for 3. No, I don't buy that. And growth rate of 2 that should have been 4, and occasionally dipped to below 0. Twice it's done that, but not 2 quarters in a row, so it's not a recession. So with all of that in mind, why did a government that started so well go bonkers? Sorry to use technical terms, but bonkers. I can't think of any practical alternative to it. And then they did a few things I think were quite smart. Yet again, we had another look at Australia's tax system. The Treasury Secretary was put in charge. I'm not sure, even though I've got high regard for him, that was a smart thing, but nevertheless. A less smart thing is to take the report at the end of 2009, hold it to the bosom like Mother Goose, release it to nobody, see contentious recommendations like minerals super profit tax and many other things, and think that you're high and mighty above it all and not discuss it with anybody who happens to be in the industry, and give them a little surprise on the 2nd of May 2010 by releasing this report, and then, when challenged why he didn't talk to the people involved, be very proud that it was the right thing. How stupid. Well, despite all of that, a government that went to the polls for the first time after it was elected in 2007 did not get thrown out, but it didn't get elected either. And then people said, well, in the light of all of this, we've got the global debt and everything going in the background of all of this. People said, well, this won't last long. Wilson government only went for 6 months in a hung parliament and had to be elected again. It's not going to last. Well, my friends, we're not there yet, but it is highly likely that this stanza of parliament is going to go full term. And I'm one of the few people who thinks it was a very good idea for the Prime Minister to tell us when we're going to have the election. I don't think it matters one way or another politically, but I think it clears the air a bit. We know that on September the 14th there will be a federal election. It looks more likely than not there'll be a change of government, but whatever it is, at least you can work on it. I mean, I happen to know I'll be in New York on that day, so I've got to do a postal vote, something the equivalent of that. But I think it was a good thing. But it's been very unstable because the only way they patched up a government was to do alliances with the Greens and the Independents. So they really had to change things. Oh yeah, maybe we said we promised there wouldn't be a carbon tax of this type, but it doesn't matter. That's what the Greens want, that's what the Independents want, so we've got to do it. The alternative, if they didn't suck up to the Greens and the Independents, this is where the politics determines so much of the economics, then they wouldn't have had their support. They would have had to go to the people and almost certainly would have been thrown out. So what would you do in that situation? Now, many people were critical of the Prime Minister, but I don't think she had an alternative, given the position they were in. And now we have an election coming up, and the global financial crisis is still with us. Why do I say that? Why did I title this the global financial crisis so far? Because, in my assessment, in trying to read the economy and make it practically relevant to people, there are things that are hanging around, that are sapping our confidence, that originate from outside the shores of Australia. And they are finance type things like debt, like uncertainty, like tourism markets, like capital flows, like markets for our exports that are more uncertain than they were in 2006/7. And so we're still in a global financial crisis, no matter what politicians or the economists have to say. And I think we'll be in this for another 5 years. I reckon we're about halfway through the global financial crisis, and I don't have any promise it'll finish at the end. But we're muddling through. Now I want to draw your attention to the bottom left panel of the first page. I'll give you the facts. Here we have the common press interpretation of debt. This is the external debt of countries named here, and I've arranged them in the order of PIIGS without any way of spelling that. And this is the ratio of those debts to the national income of the countries. And you're supposed to be alarmed and say, oh, this is the point, okay? How can I possibly do that? 109% in Portugal. It means for every euro in Portugal that they have as an income, they need more than that if they're to pay their debt off immediately. Well, of course, that's the clue to it. This is grossly irresponsible, as so much of the financial media is, and will continue to be during the Australian election, unless it follows some principles. I'll give you an answer to a question that you might ask me. If you were to buy a house, you had a $200,000 income, family income. It's not massive today. The house cost $500,000. Where I live, you wouldn't get a house for that, you'd get a shed. And you borrowed $400,000, then you have a ratio of 200% of your debt to your income, okay? Now, it's possible that that's quite all right, because the key thing is the servicing. What is the ratio of your interest and other payments to your free income after your food and other expenses. And it's probably all right on most of those numbers. So don't judge solvency by confusing a flow and a stock. A flow of income in the denominator and a stock of debt in the numerator. It's just ridiculous. But equally, just because you get good numbers in looking at what we call a servicing ratio, that's, school kids will write that one down, servicing ratio, which is the interest and other payments to the free income, okay? That's the thing you look at. My advice always would be to allow for what's going to happen to the interest, because interest rates could go up and interest rates could easily double. I don't think it's that likely, but in judging it, can you handle, this is my advice to my own children, can you handle interest rates that are not 7.5% to 8% as they are on most housing loans in Australia today, not the 3% the Reserve Bank, no one pays at interest rate. But what about 10%? Can you handle that? And if you can, what about the risk you won't have a job, or one of you won't have a job? This is risk management. But nevertheless, this debt to income ratio is quite silly. I've got some growth numbers, the most recent numbers that I can find. Growth and inflation. Growth's moderate, inflation's moderate. Median house price in Melbourne means in the sales that are going on, half go for more, half go for less than $525,000. Average earnings about $54,000 after tax. So the ratio is that if you used all your $54,000 and spent nothing on food or transport or anything, you could in fact buy 10% of a house. Now when I got married in 1969, that's why I've got the figure there, because I happen to remember it, your income could have bought 73% of a house. And what we mean by a house hasn't changed a huge amount in that time. It's amazing how little it has changed. So in the past, we could have bought 2/3 to 3/4 of the house. Now all you can buy is a big dummy. So this is the most potent way I can show something in a room full of people of varying ages, that those of us who are lucky to buy our houses in the old days are sitting pretty, and the young people have a real problem. And I have an economic solution. This is purely economics. If you get a job in the next 5 to 10 years and you've got that $200,000, it'll still be a stretch. My optimal solution for you is to wait for a wealth transfer. Now, for the parents, my advice to you is if you dine with your children, be very careful what they put into your breakfast cereal, because my solution to them is to knock you off. That is when it's going to happen. And of course that's happening already, because behind every residential auction in Melbourne is a superannuated funded parent who is helping most of it. So we've already done a lot of the agenda, and the international perspective is we have China growing at 12 to 15% volume terms, I mentioned volume, until the global financial crisis spiked down to 7 and back to 9 and sauntering along quite nicely at 9. You can ask me questions about China, but it has a great value to Australia by sending lots and lots of wealthy Chinese students to help Australian universities, and it does a little bit for the mining industry as well. India, that was the other big growth country. Its most spectacular growth is in the people, not diminished by one-child policy, and sometime in the next 10 or 15 years there'll be more BODs in India than in China. But the growth's not so good, because the growth dropped to about 3%, which is a sort of Australian level, and it hasn't recovered. Check it all out. If you want to check these things out, it's very easy, because you can go into a free website called www.worldwideweight.rba, Reverse Bank of Australia, .gov.au, and you can get all the statistics free of charge, or pay $26.15, and I'll send hard copies to you. So that's the story in relation to what is happening about China and India. Japan, well, the thing about Japan is everyone sort of knocking it, and the latest statistics are really quite adverse in Japan, although it looks like the new government is tuning in a little bit to things, but it looks all very morose. But if you go there, it's a very prosperous place. Japan is at a very high plateau. It's as clean as one thing, the people are happy, it's very, very prosperous and going nowhere, okay? Doesn't need to, it's got there. That's my feeling on Japan. And they're still buying meat and they're still taking our coal, so it's not a disaster. But on crude numbers, Japan looks very, very disappointing, and indeed for the last 30 years it has been. The big growth miracle is no longer, but it got there. Not so worried about it. Europe, well, why does Europe matter to us? It's our lineage, most of us, and we just do some trade there, they send migrants and so on. Europe, very disappointing. You may like to ask me a little more about that later. Now we come back to home and we flip the page, and I've got the back end of the history. You can read that for yourself about how people, including the central bank, sort of got it wrong about where we were going. There's too much overshooting. And the worrying thing is that almost any day in the media, and I listen to this when I'm sitting on the couch for that Channel 2 News breakfast, as I will be at 8:16 tomorrow morning, okay? 8:16 tomorrow morning, ABC 1. And just before I come on, it's the finance figures, and it's, isn't it terrible? Unemployment rates went up a point, markets went off, West Texas crude is $2 lower than it was. There were 4 or 5 things that sort of look bad news. Or it's the reverse, 2/3 of them are sort of good and stock markets are up and so on. There's too much short-termism in all of this thing. The underlying drift is the thing we need to look at. The underlying drift is reasonable. It's not great, but I think it's going to be great. Now, why do I think it's going to be great? Why am I the maverick that believes that interest rates will be a bit higher towards the end of the year? I said this in 2008 and told I was a heretic. And then, of course, I don't necessarily like the British. I just wish the Reserve Bank wouldn't play this game because they're not good at it. But my job's to forecast what they're going to do, because what they do impacts on real people. Well, I think there's a replacement cycle out there. Many people have gained significantly from, take this, ready? The speaker makes prominent point. That's the one, you missed it, Charles. Speaker makes prominent point at Royal Institute Conference. The replacement cycle is that many people have gained from relatively moderate, high quality consumer durables, and many of us have bought them, but that was a big surge and it's gone into a bit of a lull because most of us don't need to replace TVs, etc. At the moment we've got our Blu-ray player. By the way, if you like DVDs and you haven't got a Blu-ray player, you're absolutely nuts, because you can buy them for about $100 and all you, write it down Patrick, all of you, and I tell your wife because she's a decision maker, Blu-ray player, video and audio enrichment, they're so much better, and you don't need to get rid of all your old discs, because all the old DVDs will play even better. And if you like music, and my definition of music may be different to yours, but anything after Beethoven isn't, and classical CDs, they just play beautifully in these things. Now the other tip is get a sound bar, all right? Now some of these wonderful TVs look great, but the volume is rubbish on them, all right? So you need a sound bar. You don't need all the rest. And the sound bar shoots stuff all around the room so that it's rather like listening to a person with a big voice. You can actually hear it everywhere. And sound bar, very, very, very good. And so there you are. Now, in the context of that, many people are getting to the point where they do need to replace a bit more. And if I get my Blu-ray LED recovery, by the way, there's other technology following this, which is the reason that Blu-ray is now cheap. But it doesn't matter. It's still, don't wait for the new one. The Blu-ray is such an improvement. But the degree of ignorance, it's almost like trams in Melbourne. The longest thing in Melbourne is the queue of old people waiting to touch off on the tram when you don't have to. You don't touch off on trams, okay? But what does the brainwashed drink? Touch on, touch off, touch on, touch off. And then typically, an old person with a senior on their car, whoops, senior, will stick the thing on and then drops and then pick it up. Arthritis takes over. There's ignorance everywhere. You don't touch off on trams. And you don't fail to get Blu-rays. And with this Blu-ray-led recovery, it doesn't matter who wins this election, the Australian economy is in very, very good shape. Because there's so much ignorance. People who haven't bought them yet, and I'm only on 10% for this one, your life will be enriched. Because there's nothing else on television to watch other than me at 8:16 in the morning, and I'm not on at night, so you need a Blu-ray recorder for all of this. So what's going to happen?
Go to a live concert.
I think that's a very good day as well, but then you've got parking, and yeah. I got here by tram today. In fact, when I became an MCC full member about 20 years ago, I discovered trams again. And you know what? I hadn't been on one for years. As soon as I got into it, I went for the seatbelt. That's how brainwashed I was. We have a very precious country. We have a good legacy. Ignorance and so on is part of it, but I don't care who you vote for. I do care about Australia, and we are about to start a campaign in which the only thing anyone agrees with is both leaders are not the highest quality we've ever had. That's about the only thing that anyone can generally. So let's hope that puts us onto the issues, and there will be issues, and there'll be issues about carbon tax. It's a relatively small thing, and mining tax and so on. My previous view, until recently, was that the opposition's proposed abolition of these would not happen because the track record of oppositions proposing to get rid of big tax things is very bad. The Liberals detested the Medicare system in 1974 and vowed they'd get rid of it. They came in and left it and raised the Medicare levy. The Liberals, again, this becomes politically neutral at the end, don't worry, detested the higher education contribution system, sensible funding for students, and vowed to get rid of it. And then the Labor Party, they didn't, they just increased it. The Labor Party vowed to get rid of GST, Simon Creed, you may have forgotten him, but he was the leader of the Labor Party at the time. Not only did they keep it, but they did what the Libs should have done, and that is bringing it formally into the budget system. So what's going to happen? We're going to have debates about budget deficits and these policies and so on. I think it's increasingly likely that they will scrap the taxes because the mining tax, for example, is a sum tax. Some of the products, some of the companies, some of the profits, some of the time, and most of the time next to nothing. And do you realise one of the loopholes, and this is not just the published thing, that you can take off state land tax and royalties and so on, but you can depreciate as much as you want. I mean, depreciation is meant to be a share of fixed asset costs, but if you think it's going to go, well, why pay any money at all? So why not just write it off now, think there'll be a change of government, believe the rhetoric, and away it goes. And let's go. This is self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's changed my view, because I think we are going to see most likely a change of government, and most likely the ending of these taxes, because they bring in so little revenue, then the cost is just about nothing for getting rid of what's just about nothing. So we're going to have that, but these are the things that I think you need to watch for. Number one, every representation to the people should have a clearly stated objective as to what the point of it is, whether it's a change in the health system, or a new charge for something, or an environmental initiative. The second thing is there should be a research basis for that policy being the best, okay? And if they don't give it, we should ask it. The next thing is, we're going to have a debate about what's called costing. I don't like the term costing because the other half of the budget is about revenue. So my word is valuation. We need to value the expenditure promises and the taxes, and we want to see both sides of it. And we want to see it without the barren palm tree disease. The barren palm tree disease is no dates. We need dates on everything. We need the times when this is going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, then we should make our politicians accountable. Now, when I'm in the media and in any event like this, I will be following all the representations to the Australian people and protesting without fear and favour that we don't get it. And I predict that if I don't stop in 30 seconds, the chairman will rise. And secondly, I predict that we're going to get a breach of every one of those policies. Nevertheless, as we look globally, thank God we're in Australia. Thank you very much indeed.